I would like to focus my remarks on the challenge for China's economic reform from the perspective of a holistic approach. Let me try to figure out. Page down. Okay, good. A holistic approach to economic reform would require well-defined goals, strategies, and measures for the reform. It would also require consistency in the reform of various markets and different economic sectors. By a holistic approach, attention should be paid to the coherence in reforming different institutions, namely economic, social, and political institutions. It would also take into account the compatibility of China's reform to the role China wants to play in the world. The reform guidelines released recently by the third plenum of the 18th CPC Central Committee and the newly launched Shanghai Free Trade Zone provided us good references to discuss these issues. Let me start with a global perspective of China's reform. We live in a dynamic world of rapid and constant change, thanks largely to the ICT revolution, which allows people from different parts of the world to exchange views and experiences in the speed of light. Among these changes are the institutional changes, that is, the changes in the way by which we organize our society. Some institutional changes are eruptive, such as those occurred in the Middle East, which we call them revolutions. Other institutional changes are gradual in a managed process. We call them reforms. So it is true to a large extent that countries undertake reform for the purpose of averting revolution. Right now, actually, almost every country in the world undertakes economic reform. For example, we know in the US that the Dodd-Frank Act for financial reform, Obama healthcare reform, in Euro area, to try to set up the bank union. Even North Korea and Cuba have also taken economic reforms by launching special economic zones. So in this regard, China's economic reform is not an isolated case, but part of the global wave of reforms. As stated in the most recent CPC reform guidelines, reform is China's talisman, that is a magic weapon, to catch up with the global trends in the modern era. So to some extent, China undertakes reform in response to the rapid changes in the global trends. For instance, China has launched the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, partly because of the increasing competition from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Of course, it is also true that the TTP and TTIP are undertaken by those countries involved in response exactly to the increasing competition from China as well. So in this sense, China's reform is both driven by and also contributing to the global wave of reforms. In general, China has clearly defined the goals for its economic reform. For example, the CCP reform guidelines. In this guideline, the general goals for the overall reforms in the next decade is defined as to improve and develop China's socialist system and modernize China's governance structure. The guidelines have also defined a number of specific goals for the reforms in 6 broad areas: economic, political, cultural, social, ecological, and defense and military. So in the area of economic reforms, the goals include, for example, establish a proper relationship between the government and the market to let the market play the decisive role in allocating resources. And there are other goals. I'm going to skip those. In terms of a strategy, we know that over the past 3 decades, China's economic reform has mostly followed the strategy of crossing river by groping the stone underfoot. For a number of reform measures in the past, China would always start with pilot programs before adopt them to the whole country. This strategy seems to have worked so far in China. It has placed risk under control. It has also dodged resistance to reforms by letting those who are against the reforms benefit from the pilot programs first. So it's kind of a buying out strategy. But this strategy has obvious limitations and shortcomings. It allows a small group of people or insiders to get rich by engaging arbitrage between the special zones or from the two-track pricing systems. So currently, more sophisticated institutional reforms, such as financial reforms, may not be able to follow this strategy. The Shanghai Free Trade Zone is a case in point. This newly launched free trade zone can promote the upgrading of China's trade in services and the changing in certain regulations or market entry. However, I don't believe this free trade zone could fulfill the purpose of liberalizing interest rates and floating renminbi exchange rate because it is infeasible to block financial flows from running between the free zone and the rest of the country to take the arbitrage on the differentials in interest rate and exchange rates. So as people say figuratively today, the ship of Chinese economy is navigating in deep water, too deep to grasp any stone. So that's why the CPC reform guidelines try to promote a new strategy of combining top design and cross river by grouping stone underfoot together. And the plan set up a leading group for reform at the top level. Let me see, we can skip a few, okay. Ensuring consistency in the reform of various economic sectors is very important. For example, as learned from the lessons of the Asia financial crisis in the 1990s, in reforming the financial system, it is crucial to liberalize interest rates and deepen the bond markets before adopting a floating exchange rate regime, to be followed by then a full opening of capital and financial accounts. Another example, by liberalizing interest rates in China, commercial banks will be under pressure as their monopoly profit from the interest rate differentials will be squeezed. However, the state-owned enterprises may suffer even bigger than the banks, as they will face much higher financial cost. Therefore, the reform to liberalize interest rate has to be integrated with the reforms of commercial banks and the state-owned enterprises. The last one. The most challenging part in China's reform is to ensure coherence among the reforms of different institutions. The CPC reform guidelines have indeed emphasized the importance of a systematic, integrated, and coordinated approach to the reforms in 6 different areas, as I just mentioned. However, the guidelines have obviously charted the economic reform far in advance of the reforms in other institutions. For example, in the area of political reform, after 20 years of experimenting on direct voting for the government at the village level, the guidelines have shown little plan to promote direct voting for the government at higher levels in the next decade. So in summary, China is facing challenges to ensure consistency, coherence, and compatibility in its overall reforms. However, as President Xi made it clear, reform has no perfect tense, but only continuous tense. So as long as China continues its reform to improve economic freedom, efficiency, social equity, participatory and democratic governance, the rule of law, and the environmental sustainability, China can overcome the so-called middle-income trap and become a high-income modern society in the next 2 decades or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much.